Thank you so much. And you also teach at Middlebury Institute, you teach terrorism. Is QAnon an extension of that course, or is that morphing more into kind of the radical right in America?
So I teach a course on introduction to terrorism, and there is a module in that course on cults where we discuss groups like Shurikyo and the Mujahideen cult. But of course, in that class, we are talking also about QAnon in the context of cults and terrorism. And in the course I'm developing for the Middlebury Institute, in fact, for the fall, there'll be a module related to cults in the American radical right, of which, of course, QAnon is very well postured, unfortunately, and we'll be talking a lot about QAnon in that class too.
I don't like to quote Fox News too much, but I know one of their evening program hosts has called QAnon followers gentle patriots waving flags. It was Tucker Carlson. I mean, do you think he's living on another planet, or is grouping QAnon in a category of terrorism too harsh?
I don't think it's too harsh. I most certainly would disagree with Tucker Carlson's assessment that, you know, all QAnon adherents are gentle patriots. I think we saw firsthand on the 6th of January that there are quite a few QAnon adherents who are anything but gentle. Ashley Babbitt stormed the Capitol. Of course, she was killed, but she was a QAnon follower, as was the QAnon shaman. You know, in that individual had a spear in the Capitol, and he's behind bars. So there are quite a few individuals within QAnon who've carried out violence even before the 6th of January. And it is an extremist ideology. There's no two ways about it. And because it's an extremist ideology, I think it's a disservice to call these individuals just simply gentle patriots. I would, you know, characterize the events of January 6th like Christopher Wray did, the director of the FBI. He called it an act of domestic terrorism. So there were certainly then, thus, individuals within QAnon who stormed the Capitol, who I think we should consider as domestic terrorists. So we can't let them off like that in the way Tucker Carlson described them.
Is there a link between white supremacists, some of the dangerous white supremacists, and QAnon? Are there links there?
There is. If you examine the Q drops from the so-called Q, who nobody knows exactly who Q is still to this day, but the individual purports to have a military level clearance and is inside the US government working on defense intelligence issues. In Q's early messages, very early on, he took a very anti-Semitic approach to discussing the so-called deep state being funded by the Rothschilds and the Soroses of the world. So there is an inherent anti-Semitism within the QAnon movement that makes me really uncomfortable. And in that sense, there are some analogies that you can draw between some of the more hardcore white supremacists and their ideology, as well as the QAnon theories that some subscribe to. That's not to say that all QAnon, you know, adherents are certainly white supremacists. They're a very diverse set of individuals. But some of those underlying theories of QAnon are anti-Semitic, and people need to understand that.
Is the QAnon that we talked about in the summer, you know, a bizarre far-right conspiracy group that, I mean, thinks that the Democrats are holding children hostages and drinking the blood of children, and you know, it's really almost, I shake my head every time I go through this stuff. But have they evolved from what they were in the summer to where we are now in terms of the QAnon that is rooted in America?
So QAnon has undergone a shock to the system. Many of the adherents thought on January 20th, the United States military was going to encircle President Biden and all his associates and take them out. And that didn't happen. President Biden was sworn in and he's running the government. And that led for many members to a situation where they had this cognitive dissonance where what they believed was illustrated to be patently false. So you had some individuals.
But then again on March 4th, what was it?
Yes, yeah, March 4th, exactly. There was another conspiracy theory that President Trump was going to be sworn in on the 4th of March, dating back to some bizarre, convoluted scheme dating back to 1871, where the United States became a corporation instead of a country, and that on March 4th, the United States would become a country again led by Donald Trump, who would become the
if you told me that on March 3rd, lawmakers would sit longer to pass legislation so that they weren't going to be in Congress on the 4th, and that they would essentially, some of them leave Washington on the 4th, I'd say, come on, Jason. And that's exactly what happened.
It was, because there was also credible warnings by the U.S. law enforcement community that there were individuals who were trying to take advantage of that date of March 4th to carry out potentially attack against the United States Congress. And because of that, congressional deliberations were stalled. So people took that date seriously in law enforcement because they learned from the 6th of January that there are individuals who really are bent on destroying democracy in the United States. And some of those individuals inevitably are still part of the QAnon community. I said there are some individuals who certainly have walked away because they see that there have been just nothing but false prophecies associated with Q's messages. But there are those people, and I wrote an article recently in the Los Angeles Times, who are doubling down. And those are the most ardent supporters within cults. You know, cults historically have changed dates. You know, whether it's the Heaven Gates cult from the 1970s to 1990s, when, you know, essentially they changed the date and when this magical situation would occur when the UFO was going to pick them up. And you've seen it with other cults. They moved the goalposts, as it were. In QAnon, the individuals who stay within the movement are moving those goalposts to conform with their own worldviews. So that makes them really dangerous, those that remain behind.
Okay, I'm glad I let you finish that point, because that's really important. The surveys, some of the polling in America said that large groups of evangelical Christians are drawn into QAnon, and that a large number of Republican evangelical Christians belong to QAnon or follow it and identify with its philosophy, whatever that happens to be.
Absolutely. There is this movement, and it's been happening over this past year. And there are some scholars out there who track QAnon very closely, like Marc-André Argentino, who've spoken about this in some length. There is this natural religious terminology connected to the QAnon movement. The idea that there's going to be a great awakening, for instance, that has very overt religious connotations. And that is the language of QAnon, that people will become enlightened to the truth. And then once they are enlightened, that will allow for the precipitation of a, quote, storm, which would lead essentially to this bloodletting of the secret cabal that you described earlier, Dana, of Democrats, of Jews like Soros, who are funding the deep state, who are abusing children. That bloodletting will occur, and they will be destroyed and wiped off the face of the earth. So there is kind of apocalyptical, millenarian aspects to this quasi religious cult, and it is very disturbing to see that there is increasing interest within the evangelical community about what QAnon is. That's very worrisome. We're also seeing in some of the research we're doing at the Soufan Center that there is a lot of anti-abortion rhetoric now associated with individuals who populate the QAnon community. And that's worrisome because in terms of acts of violence perpetuated in the United States by individuals, there have been a significant number of attacks against things like the Planned Parenthood, doctors who have provided abortions. So I do worry that there could be a QAnon follower who is now avidly drinking up some of these anti-abortion related conspiracies who could do real world harm. Is
the FBI now, have they shifted philosophically and said, okay, we have, first of all, domestic terrorism is the greatest threat in America right now, more than ISIS or Al Qaeda, or, I mean, we've at least heard that from them testifying, before one of the congressional committees, the head of the FBI. Is QAnon now somebody, a group that is being taken very, very seriously by law enforcement officials? And do they need to classify them as a potential terror group in order to source funding, in order to intercept communications? Are they equipped as a law enforcement agency currently to deal with QAnon's threat?
So back in 2019, the Arizona Phoenix FBI field office declared the QAnon conspiracy theory to be a domestic terrorism threat. And in that sense, the FBI, at least somewhat early on, probably not as early as they could have, started thinking about those who subscribe to that theory as being potentially dangerous individuals. And then you fast forward in time to January 6th, I think the writing became very clearly on the wall. We know a couple of very specific cases of QAnon supporters who were part of that insurrection. But if you look at the symbols of the day, you saw a lot of QAnon shirts, QAnon regalia, even of individuals who did not go into the Capitol building, who still protested, which was their right to protest, right? But once you cross that breach the barrier, that's another story. Is the FBI well postured to deal with QAnon and just domestic terrorism writ large? FBI Director Christopher Wray testified, I think it was last week. I think it was the week of the 1st of March 2nd, in that time period. And he said in 2 years, there's been more than 100% growth in domestic terrorism investigations, from 850 in 2019 to 2,000 in 2021. I imagine of that subset, there are most certainly QAnon-related investigations that are ongoing with the FBI. But with such an explosion of cases, I do worry that the FBI may not have all the resources and FBI agents they could use to tackle this threat. And I think Christopher Wray said as much. So I don't think they're as well postured as they could be. And I think dealing with an ideology, which is what the QAnon conspiracy theory really has become, is exceedingly difficult to counter, as opposed to maybe one or two individuals bent on violent activity. The ideology allows for individuals to become radicalized, and that is more of a long-term and enduring challenge that goes simply beyond the writ of the FBI.
When you look at what former President Trump said about QAnon, back in August, he said, I've heard these people just love our country. Do you believe that with kind of a wink and a nod, he tapped into QAnon to bolster his support, to bolster support at the rallies, and maybe to supercharge them on the way to the Capitol?
Unfortunately, I do think, either witting or unwittingly, it's hard to know, President Trump certainly used buzzwords over a long period of time that motivated individuals within the QAnon community. He was always reluctant in the lead up to the election to condemn them, to chastise them for being engaged in problematic behavior, which they were, both online and in the real world. And in that sense, I think he unfortunately emboldened individuals within the QAnon community. And if you look at—
So which one is it, wittingly or unwittingly?
I'm not sure with President Trump, honestly. It's hard to say what's going through that guy's mind. So it's hard for me to conjecture. I will tell you this, though. If you look at the individuals who have been arrested, whether they're QAnon or they're something else, they all have said they were following the words and orders of President Donald J. Trump. And they actually felt they were fulfilling a mission on his behalf. And there's no two ways about that. So whether he's witting or unwitting, to me, a president has to be very careful about the language that they use, and he was not.